I don't think I see you, no.
Okay, it's not so important, but let's start. And I will, hello everyone. We are also here, about 20 maybe. And I wanted to thank you for the thing that you accept to do this seminar. It's very, for us, it's we are honored to have you here. So I will introduce you a bit to others. So Antonella Sorace is Professor of Development Linguistics at the University of Edinburgh. She's a Fellow of the British Academy, a Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and a Fellow of the Royal Society for the Encouragement of Arts, Manufactures and Commerce. In her career, she has held research appointments and visiting professorship at numerous institutions, including the University of Utrecht, the University of Trondheim, say if I'm pronouncing well, the University of Troms, the Max Planck Institute, and many others you can find on our event. I'll read her research focuses on a number of interrelated questions that bring together linguistics, experimental psychology, and cognitive science, and her research achievements and publications span different subfields of scientific inquiry. She is a world-leading authority of bilingualism over the lifespan and is particularly well known for her studies of exceptionally talented near-native adult second language speakers. For her research on the changes attrition that take place in the native language of advanced second language speakers. For her investigation of bilingual language acquisition in early and late childhood and of the effects of bilingualism in non-linguistic domains. She is also internationally known for her contribution to language typology, especially for her research on constraint variation and the lexicon syntax interface, which she has investigated in many languages, and her studies of gradients in natural language. Moreover, she has given an important contribution to experimental methods in linguistics by pioneering the use of magnitude estimation as a technique for the elicitation of linguistic acceptability judgments. She is committed to disseminating the findings of research of bilingualism outside academia. She is also the founding director of the Information and Consultancy Center Bilingualism Matters and was awarded a Belton Fellowship for Public Engagement. So it's a lot of things that we, I needed to read that because it's for sure I will not remember everything. So we are very honored to have you. And I think if you want to introduce you a bit, so please take it.
Thank you so much for the invitation, first of all, and the introduction. I'm delighted to be with you today, even if it's online. I very much prefer in-person meetings, but we have to do what we can do, and let's hope that we'll go back to what we used to have before long. So yes, I'm a linguist. I do research on bilingualism over the lifespan. I'm also the mother of two bilingual children, now no children anymore, but they grew up with two languages. So I'm familiar with the joys and challenges of raising bilingual children at home. Because I'm Italian, my husband is American, and our children grew up with two languages from birth. So, first of all, I would like to explain what I mean by bilingualism or multilingualism. Many people think that you're not bilingual unless you know two languages perfectly from birth. And this is not the way I'm going to use the term bilingual. For me, a bilingual is a person who knows 2 or more languages and uses them on a regular basis. Whether they've learned the 2 languages together from birth, like the happy baby there, or whether they've learned one language first and then another as children during childhood, or whether they've learned a foreign language as young adults, for example, at the university, or increasingly, whether they started another language much later in life, in their retirement years. So all of these people are bilingual or multilingual to different extents. So we mean by bilingual, we mean more than one. And I'll come back to this point, more than one. And I'll also come back to the point that the perfect bilingual doesn't exist. There's always a language that it's either very dominant or slightly dominant, depending on where you are, who you're talking to, what you're talking about. So that's just to define things. Now, I'm going to make the point that bilingualism in any languages matters and can bring benefits, potential benefits to people. And to give, again, a general context to what I'm going to say, we can start by considering the fact that we live in an English-dominant world still, in the sense that there are about 7 billion people living in the world. 1.5 billion speak English, and that's 20% of the Earth's population. And it's clear that, English is by far the most commonly studied foreign language in the world. Still, we don't know how long this will last. And this is interesting because it contributes to the fact that linguistic diversity is disappearing faster than before. So there are about between 6,000 and 7,000 languages in the world. Nobody knows how many exactly, right? But what we know is that only 25 languages accounts for more than half of the world's population. So they're spoken by more than half of the world's population. 25. That's not very many. And that means that the vast majority of languages are minority languages, and they're spoken together in a context where there is a dominant language, there is a majority language, right? And languages are disappearing very, very fast. Why are they disappearing? Because parents don't speak them to their children, because they are either forced not to speak them to their children, or they decide not to speak them to their children because they're not regarded as important, useful, prestigious, and so on. So it's been calculated that we're losing about one language every 2 to 3 weeks, which is amazing, and the rhythm is accelerating. Let's remember that linguistic diversity also means cultural diversity, and it means a resource for humanity. So the more languages disappear, the more humanities has to lose. Now, why bilingualism is important, apart from this general feature, of linguistic diversity? Why is more than one language better than just one language? We need to separate, in order to understand these benefits of bilingualism, we need to separate myths from facts. So there are still many myths on bilingualism, particularly in children, but also in adults. I'll look at them very briefly in a minute. And what is coming out of research? So let's distinguishing between myths and facts at different ages, because it's easy to talk about children versus adults, but in fact, there are different stages of childhood, and children change considerably during childhood because they develop, and lots of things develop in their brain, for example. So we can't just talk about children as an undifferentiated block. And the same applies to adults. You know, we have to distinguish between young adults and older adults, not because everything goes down as you get older. Some things go down, but as we'll see, you can compensate in many ways. And some things actually improve with age in adulthood. So this is the first thing that we need to do. But increasingly, we also need to separate science from science fiction. So there are increasing misinterpretation of research that are not very good. They are as bad as the old myths. So let's start from the myths. Remember, myths versus facts. So the myths about child language learning, a very common one still, is the fact that people think more than one language too soon makes a child confused. So, you know, a child who's exposed to more than one language may not learn to speak any language properly. So many people think, oh, it's better to wait until the first language is well established before you introduce another language. And related to that, the idea that a bilingual child, especially if they come from another language background, so, for example, Italians, you know, in the UK or Lithuanians in Italy may have a problem at school because they speak another language. They have to learn the language of schooling, the language of the community usually, and so they're going to be left behind. So, you know, very often these children are categorized as having a problem rather than bringing a resource. And then this is not a complete list, right? And yes, the idea that there are useful languages and not very useful languages. So as I said, English is still the world language, the language that everybody wants their children to learn. Chinese is on the rise because what makes a language prestigious and useful is the political and economic power of the country where the language is spoken. So clearly China is on the rise. Chinese is on the rise as well, certainly compared to 30, 40 years ago. And other, you know, languages, obviously Spanish and French and so on. But regional minority languages or indigenous minority languages, for example, like Gaelic in Scotland, Sardinian in Italy, which is very close to my heart because my mother was from Sardinia. So I know the situation quite well. My mother didn't speak Sardinian to me because she thought it wasn't very useful and not as useful as standard Italian and English, but also languages introduced by migration that are regarded as, well, yes, they may be spoken by many people in the country where they are spoken, but they're not very useful, you know, for migration communities. So what about the misconceptions about adult language learning? Well, you know, the most common one is that if you're an adult, you're not as good as a child. You need to be a child to learn a language well. All right? You can't learn a language very well as an adult. And how do you learn a language as an adult? You go to a classroom and you have a teacher who teaches you the rules of the language and corrects your mistakes. So you make mistakes, the teacher corrects you, they teach you the rules, and that's the only way to learn, right? And also, if you're an adult, obviously you have at least one language. So that language affects the language you're learning. So there are transfer errors, interference, you know, whatever you want to call them, from the first language to the second language, but not vice versa, for example. So why are these myths? Okay, let's start from an obvious benefit of bilingualism. I've already mentioned cultural awareness. Behind every language, there is a culture. And so, you know, a bilingual child is often a bicultural child or a multicultural child if there are more than two languages involved. But there are less obvious effects, and these are the ones that, you know, people don't normally know very much about, and these are the ones that, you know, I've been working on with many other people, for example. So the fact that language learning changes the brain. It changes the brain from an anatomical point of view. So it causes the growth of gray matter in particular areas of the brain. So the anatomy, the structure of the brain changes. But also it changes the brain from the point of view of connectivity. So it increases the connections, the neural connections within the brain in particular areas as well. Now, this sounds very, very interesting and perhaps, surprising. In fact, it shouldn't be too surprising because these changes in the brain have also been found as a consequence of other types of experience. So bilingualism, learning another language, is not a magic kind of experience. It's the only kind of experience that changes the brain. It's one type of experience that changes the brain, but not the only one. For example, there was a famous study a few years ago about London taxi drivers. Now, London is a big city, as all of us know. And if you are a taxi driver in London, I mean, you better have a good sense of spatial direction, right? Because you have to find your way in a very complex environment, right? And so it was found that taxi drivers in London have better spatial abilities than people who are not taxi drivers. Right, this is a clear result of their experience of having to drive a taxi in a complex spatial environment. But more recently, there have been, studies about musicians. So musical training can also change the brain in particular ways. So, and in fact, there are many studies now that compare different kinds of experiences. For example, musical training and bilingualism and language learning to see whether they change the brain in different ways or in similar ways. Now, what we are really interested in is not so much that the bilingualism changes the brain, because, after all, if it changes the brain, okay, that's very interesting, but so what? Does it actually change behavior? Does it change the way we behave? And the answer is yes. And this is more interesting from the point of view of, from the point of view of everyday life, right? Because what research shows in children, for example, it shows that bilingual children tend to have a better understanding of how language works. And when I say a better understanding, I don't mean that children can recite grammatical rules, because in fact, they don't know what to do with grammatical rules in the way we learn them as adults in a foreign language classroom, for example, because their brain is not mature enough to deal with that kind of stuff. What I mean is that they have a spontaneous understanding of how language works, a natural understanding of how language works, which is due to the fact that there are more than one language in their brain. And so this natural understanding of how language works also is an element that gives them a head start in early literacy. So when they start learning to read, for example, it has been found that having more than one language in the brain and in the environment favors the foundations of early literacy, regardless of the type of alphabet, the writing system that children learn. So for the majority of us, it's an alphabetic system. So Lithuanian, Italian, English, they all use an alphabet as a writing system, unlike Chinese, for example, unlike Arabic and so on. So the fundamental principle of all alphabetic systems is that printed letters correspond to spoken sounds. So sounds of the spoken language. This is the discovery that all children have to make when they start learning to read an alphabet, an alphabetic language. And so this is what a bilingual child has a head start in. They get this link between printed letters and spoken sounds earlier. So if they learn to read in an easy language, for example, Italian is an easier language to read because the correspondences between letters and sounds are pretty regular, much more regular than in a language like English, for example. But if they learn to read in Italian, they don't have to relearn this if they start their schooling in English or in any other alphabetic language, because they've already learned that foundation, and that gives them an advantage in learning to read other alphabetic languages. So there are also, because of this better understanding, natural understanding of language, they find it easier to learn other languages. So learning a third language or a fourth language is easier than learning a second when you start only from one. And there are an increasing number of studies that show that if you trust them, if a child, for example, comes from a different language background and learns the majority language, the language of schooling, to a reasonable level, being bilingual helps them also with respect to the majority language. So Italian if they go to Italian schools, English if they go to English-speaking schools, whatever the majority language, the language of schooling is. So remember the prejudice that, you know, if you come from a bilingual background, you have a problem because you're not as good as a monolingual child in the majority language. Actually, not necessarily, because there is this natural understanding that applies to the majority language as well. Many parents worry about language mixing, and as I said, I'm a parent, and I remember when my children started mixing. That's an example of from one of my sons, when he used to say things like, "Mamma, mangiamo patate crunciose stasera." Now, that means, "Mommy, are we eating roast potatoes tonight?" Now, what that is, why that's interesting, it's interesting because crunciose doesn't exist in Italian. It's totally made up on the basis of English crunchy. Right, so, but if you look at that sentence, it's perfect. It's perfect in Italian, not only from the point of view of pronunciation, but also the grammar. Crunciose agrees with patate, so feminine plural. Crunciose follows patate, as it should in Italian. In English, it should precede the word patate. So it's a perfect example of very good knowledge of the Italian grammar, even if there is some mixing. And this is what the literature, research on language mixing actually shows. Mixing shows, in general, good competence in both languages. And mixing can actually be good within the family, you know, within our family. We still mix for particular purposes because all of us, you know both languages. And so mixing in many ways allows us to express more complex messages, you know, more interesting messages, you know, within our context. So language mixing is not necessarily a sign of confusion. Now, the outside language, there are very interesting effects of bilingualism that have been found both in children and in adults. Remember that this applies also to adults who learn another language later, not necessarily only to children who grow up with two languages. So one interesting effect is a greater awareness that other people can have a different perspective from your own. Now, this is a discovery that all children make. Remember that a young baby is very egocentric. You know, they think they're the center of the world. They think that everybody can read their mind. And then slowly they discover that, hey, it's not true. If you're sitting there, you can't see what I have here. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you know, then it's difficult for you to follow what I'm saying. So that discovery that you have to take the other person's perspective into account is facilitated by bilingualism. And you may wonder why. The reason is that a bilingual child discovers very soon that not everybody is bilingual. And so they have to choose the right language depending on the person they're talking to. So in order to do that, they have to step outside their linguistic domain and embrace the linguistic perspective of the other person. And this is expanded outside language and leads to a better awareness that it is possible to have a different perspective or a different point of view, which is kind of very important in today's society, right? To be able to have this awareness that there are multiple points of view, there are multiple perspectives, and you can take them into account. There are many studies showing that bilingualism actually can lead, as we'll see, not automatically, but it can lead to better control of attention. Now, attention is something that we need no matter what we do. If we do anything, we need to pay attention to what we're doing. Otherwise, we don't do it well. And there are always things that might distract our attention. It might be a worry, it might be a noise, it might be something that comes up in the environment, whatever. So paying selective attention means paying focused attention, being able to focus on what matters in whatever you're doing, and at the same time disregard what doesn't matter for the task you're doing. So this is what bilingualism has been found to contribute to, and also an ability to handle conflicting information and also switch from one task to the other. So this is called flexibility, mental flexibility in switching from on one situation or one task to the other, or adaptability to change, which is something that we face in our everyday life, right? We are constantly, doing multiple things, at the same time. We have to pay attention to multiple things. Now, again, you may wonder, why does bilingualism give you these advantages? It's because, in general, when you speak one language, you have to exclude the other or the others that you might know, right? So you can't speak all languages at the same time. When you speak one, you have to exclude the others. So this constant mental gymnastics of focusing on one language and excluding the others, or inhibiting the others, that's the technical term, is again reflected outside the language domain and leads to a better ability to handle conflicting information, switch, focus on something in particular, and exclude other things. So again, a very good general ability outside language. For adults, remember that the prejudices about adults that, if you start a language as an adult, you can't reach, high levels. Actually, you can. In Edinburgh, we specialize on studying, these native-like non-native speakers. So people who reach incredibly high levels, they can pass for native speakers, if not at all levels, at many levels. So native-like levels of proficiency are possible, and these people, believe me, are not Martians. They have a brain like mine and yours. So they're perfectly normal people. So if it's possible for them, it must be possible more generally. So what are what we study is what makes it possible. Yes, there are individual differences, but there may be environmental differences that facilitate, reaching these high levels. And remember that for many of us, many adults, the main difference between adults and children is that children have a lot of time. So a young child is fully immersed in the language. They don't have a job to worry about. They don't have a family to worry about. So they can, really fully immersed in a way that many adults can't be, because there are many competing commitments in their life. So there is brain plasticity also in older adults at all ages. This is what the research actually shows in many fields. There is more brain plasticity and flexibility all life long compared to what it was used to be known and thought. It used to be thought that a child is maximally flexible and then your brain kind of becomes more rigid. Actually, brain plasticity is kept throughout life and is exercised in different ways. And in fact, even for adults can, learn another language. Their brain responds very well. They may not have the time scale of a young child to improve their language, but definitely their brain responds to the challenge of learning a new language. And if there are multiple languages throughout a lifetime, it has been found that multilingualism can delay some cognitive aspects of aging. So it can act as a cognitive reserve, delaying aging. You know, loss of memory, loss of ability to focus. All of these are natural ways, natural effects of aging that happens to everybody. And people can compensate in many different ways. Multilingualism is a way of compensating for these effects of aging. So that's what I mean by a cognitive reserve. And in fact, these cognitive effects are found across the lifespan. Our research has found cognitive effects, the cognitive effects I mentioned, in university students of languages. So young adults learning another language, coming from a monolingual environment and learning another language to a high level at university, but also in much older learners. So as I said, people who start another language in their 70s or even in their 80s, and their brain really responds very well. Now, new myths, remember distinguishing between science and science fiction? Now, the new myths are, for example, oh, bilingual children are geniuses, right? I mean, you give a child more than one language and you turn them into a genius. No, we're not talking about geniality. We're not talking about intelligence per se. We're talking about an extra gear that can facilitate life in a variety of situations. We're talking about an extra gear that can benefit the whole of the school curriculum, you know, and not just languages per se, but also maths, for example, history, you know, language in other aspects of the curriculum. And then, you know, for older people, is it true that bilinguals don't get Alzheimer's? And every time a journalist asks me this question, I respond, I wish. I wish it was true. Unfortunately, it's not true, because we're not talking about preventing dementia or, you know, we're talking about delaying the normal effects of aging, but also delaying the initial symptoms of some kinds of dementia. So that means that, you know, studies have shown that if somebody is unlucky enough to get dementia, their symptoms start about 4 or 5 years later in multilingual older people compared to monolingual older people. 4 or 5 years may strike you as not very long, but it is a very long time in terms of independent life and autonomy when that kind of disease strikes. So these are the new myths that are arising, and we have to actually counteract them as well. The main point that I wanted to make is that it doesn't matter which language is. So what matters for these benefits is the fact of having more than one language in the brain, not the fact of speaking, you know, a prestigious language or a useful language or a language spoken by billions of people in the world. So there are no useful, more useful or less useful or useful or useless languages from this point of view. All languages are good. All varieties of languages are good. All dialects are good. And I'll be happy to answer questions about this, you know, because many people think, oh, but I speak a dialect, I don't speak a language. But a dialect, remember that the distinction between languages and dialects is a political distinction in many ways. It's not a cognitive distinction. Dialects, what are regarded as dialects, sometimes are more different from the main language, from the majority language, than another language. So I'm talking about all languages, varieties of languages, or dialect. Having more than one is good. Do you need to speak like a native? Do you need to be completely perfect? As I said at the beginning, no, because the perfect bilingual doesn't exist. And our levels of competence change according to where we are. I was in Sardinia, in Italy, for a month until recently, until last week. And, you know, definitely my access to Italian vocabulary became better than what I usually have here. Does it mean that I forgot English? Of course not. But it meant that, you know, there my Italian was activated in to a much greater extent. And And bilinguals, I think it should be fairly clear at this point, they're not the sum of two monolinguals. We shouldn't regard bilinguals as a monolingual in language A and a monolingual in language B and expect them to behave like monolinguals in language A and monolinguals in language B. And unfortunately, this is a problem in many educational and health settings, because many tests that are used in an educational setting or in a health environment are developed on the basis of monolingual norms rather than bilingual norms. So, for example, they test how many words does a typical monolingual 6-year-old child knows. Well, you can get a number there, but if you use the same test to test a bilingual child, they may not do very well because their words are divided across languages. So you have to take into account the words that they know in the other language. And this is why we're working with, both educational authorities and health authorities to make sure that they use different tests and diagnostic tests to measure, to test bilingual children and adults. The benefits are not automatic. I mentioned that simply because the bilingual experience can be very different. So it's not that you're either bilingual or you're not. You can be bilingual, as I said, to different extents. And so there is a continuum that goes from less bilingual to more bilingual, where many factors can play a role. For example, are you speaking two different languages? Typologically different languages or two similar languages? How much do you use both languages and how much exposure do you get? As I said, as I will say again, this can be very variable. Individual differences, attitudes, and so on. Let's have a look at some of these factors and the implications for families, for teaching and learning in schools, for multilingual classrooms that are a reality in all of our countries now, for indigenous regional minority languages, for language policy in general. So for early bilingualism in children, what matters in families, for example, is enough exposure. So this is something that many bilingual families actually not considered fully, because they think, oh, I speak a language, my partner speaks another language, so of course our child is going to be bilingual. Not really. If the child never or almost never hears, the language of one of the parents because the parent is never there or is there only half an hour or an hour a day, that is not very good. So the family has to create an environment where both languages are heard in engaging situations, because you're not teaching languages to children. This is something that many parents are, oh, I'm teaching my language to my child. You don't teach a language. Your child will learn a language naturally if they hear enough of it in situations that they find motivating. So this is not always easy to create an environment where both languages are heard. In my case, in my family, for example, because we live in an English-speaking environment and I work full-time, if I had been the only source of input in Italian, well, my son's Italian wouldn't be very good. We decided to create a community. We decided to meet with other parents, in the community on a regular basis. We had Italian babysitters, only Italian babysitters who could speak Italian to our children, and so on and so forth. Variety of speakers, this is very connected. A child needs to hear the language not only from mommy or daddy, but from potentially many speakers. Sometimes there is a whole community around, sometimes there isn't. So is it easy to create a community? It can be done. It's a bit of a challenge, but it can be done. It's useful for a child to hear the language spoken in different ways. Remember that everybody speaks in different ways. So, even two people don't speak necessarily in the same way, because children learn what is possible in the language and what is not possible in the language. But also they learn that, hey, that's not just mommy's language or daddy's language. It's a language used by everybody. It's a language in which you can say anything that you can say in the majority language. And that's very useful from the point point of view of attitudes. Literacy can be very useful, so learning to read, because it gives children access to a variety of sources of input, books, internet nowadays, of course, social media, and things like that. So learning to read is definitely very, very good. So there was something else, and positive attitudes. So positive attitudes, as we'll see later, are very important. You know, children don't like feeling different. They like, they don't understand necessarily the benefits of bilingualism, you know, as in the way that we understand them. So positive attitudes are important. For language learning at school, very often people think, children learn like sponges, you know, their brain is like a sponge, you give them some exposure, whoop, they suck it up and magically they learn a language. This is not the way it actually works. Younger is not necessarily better unless, and I'm talking about schools, there is enough input in the second language, unless there is enough engagement in the second language, unless there is enough variety of speakers in the same language. And this is something that many schools can't really provide, no matter, you know, how well-intentioned they are. There are no difficult languages for children because all languages are in principle learnable by young children, but children don't learn like adults, remember? So they rely on other cognitive mechanisms. They can extract the grammar of a language naturally, spontaneously, if they hear enough of the language. They don't need to study the grammatical rules. So we have to have realistic expectations about learning outcomes. With the work that we've done, we're doing with Scottish schools in Scotland. Scotland introduced a policy where 2 languages are introduced in primary schools, in elementary schools, from age 5, one at age 5, one at age 9 or 10. And that's why the policy is called 1+2. And we worked with the government, you know, for the creation of this policy. And now we're working on the implementation and the assessment of the policy. And one thing that it's really still not very clear to many teachers and policymakers is that children learn differently at different ages. So a 5-year-old doesn't learn in the same way as a 9-year-old. Officially, they're both children, but their brain can be very different because a lot happens between the ages of 5 and 9. 1 hour a week is the classic time devoted to a foreign language. Is that enough input? The answer is no, it's not. Particularly the younger the child, the more input they need. Teachers should be trained on language learning, on how children learn languages. This doesn't happen on a regular basis. It happens at a very, occasional basis still. But all teachers should be trained when they enter the profession, but also when they do the in-service training during the profession, during their career. And parents should be informed and help to support their child. So parents, can actually support their child, encourage their child, make their child enthusiastic about language learning if they have the right information. So, basically language learning at school, the younger you start, the more there is a trade-off, in early bilingual education. So, if you start early, you rely on younger brain. Children are much more enthusiastic for fun activities, so you can rely on that. You have more time ahead to develop real language skills, and you can actually underpin the curriculum because language learning can help, many different aspects of the school curriculum and different subject matters. However, that's the trade-off. It requires much more exposure and engagement that many schools are unable to provide. Good teacher training, good parental support. So that's the trade-off that many countries and many schools have to face. Migrant families, many migrant families are convinced that they better stop speaking their home language because their child has to integrate. Their child has to integrate linguistically and socially. They have to learn the language of the community, and the home language can be an obstacle. Actually, it's not. We work with migrant families all the time to persuade them that not only is their language not an obstacle, it can be an advantage in learning the community language. It can be an advantage in providing children with the benefits that I mentioned. Clearly, there are challenges that can't be underestimated, many challenges for migrant families. Very often they are learning the language of the community themselves. And that's one more reason why stopping speaking the home language and replacing them with a language that everybody is learning and speaks imperfectly doesn't help family communication in the first place. And it's not very good from that point of view. But maintaining the home language is definitely not an obstacle. It can even be an advantage. And there is a tendency for migrant families and migrant children to pathologize, and problematize issues related to migration. I said that at the beginning, a migrant child is seen as having a problem that needs to be solved in many environments rather than bringing a resource. And that's because of the monolingual and monocultural bias in educational and diagnostic tools that I've already mentioned. And considering bilinguals as the sum of two monolinguals. For regional indigenous minority languages, these are all under threat. I said that at the beginning, only 25 languages spoken by half of the world's population. So many of these are perceived as not useful, as interfering with the majority language and competing with other desirable languages. So many of these languages are under threat. And we try to work with people speaking indigenous minority languages to actually persuade them, hey, if there is a language spoken there, it's a resource. It's something that governments should invest in, to really preserve them and develop them. So we did research on this. So I'll just mention very briefly, research on multilingual classrooms, which are a reality in many of our countries, right? So multilingual classrooms. We did a research where we had more or less multilingual classrooms. So classrooms where more than 50% of children were from different language backgrounds versus classrooms where only 5% of children came from other backgrounds, and most of children were monolingual Scottish children. And everybody had to learn a new language, which was Spanish. There were no Spanish speakers. Spanish was new for all. And we measured over a year, we measured the learning of Spanish, their English. So we tested their English as the community and the language of schooling, and we gave them cognitive tests as well. And what came out of this research? It came out that more multilingual children passed the Spanish and the cognitive tests than the monolingual children, despite the fact that many of these children were still learning English as the majority language. But the most interesting fact was that there was a trend that needs to be backed up by more research, where the monolingual Scottish children in more multilingual classrooms actually did better in many of these tests. And that means that even passive exposure to other languages, being surrounded by people, children speaking other languages, that even if these languages are not understood, can actually be good for children. And there are other studies that have been done on adults in America, for example. So the effects of being surrounded, of living in multilingual communities, can actually modify the brain in a way that is not totally understood, but it seems to be good. And this is, the effects of, multilingual societies, people living in multilingual communities. There was a famous study where monolingual Californian adults were compared with monolingual Pennsylvanian adults. California is different from Pennsylvania because California is much more multilingual than central Pennsylvania. And so everybody had to learn Finnish as the new language, very hard language to learn. And both behavioral tests were given, but also the brain was measured, brain activity, and bilingual were tested too. And what came out was that the monolingual Californians really, their brain changed much faster than the brain of the monolingual Pennsylvanians. And possibly because their brain was already different by the fact that they were exposed to multilingual societies and many languages in their environment. Now, many prejudices about minority languages, I hear these all the time. A child who speaks Sardinian can't speak Italian well. A child who speaks Gaelic, no, they're not very good at English. Or by defenders, of minority languages. Well, minority languages are contaminated by bilingualism. They are contaminated by the majority language. Why is this wrong? We did research on Sardinian where we compared Italian Sardinian bilingual children with Italian monolingual children. We gave them cognitive tests, we measured their Italian, and we found that in many cases there was no difference. When there was a difference, it was in favor of the bilingual children. So again, you don't find always differences, but we never found a difference that disadvantaged bilinguals. The only difference that we found was in favor of the Italian Sardinian bilingual children. This is an environment where there is no Sardinian as a medium of education. So Sardinian tends to be a home language. Unlike Gaelic, Scottish Gaelic, there are schools where Gaelic is the medium of instruction. So Gaelic is used to teach everything. They're not even bilingual schools. Everything is taught in Gaelic. And we did the same study comparing English Gaelic bilingual children with English monolingual children. Again, we found that where there was a difference, it was in favor of the bilingual children. We also measured, we tested new speakers, adolescents who had learned Gaelic only at school and who came from non-Gaelic speaking families. And these are the new speakers that the Scottish government invests in, by the way. The Scottish government thinks, quite rightly, that, if we create new speakers of Gaelic, those speakers, when the time comes, will speak Gaelic to their children. And so the intergenerational transmission of the language will continue and the language will survive. But what we found was that, although these new speakers spoke Gaelic very well, they have favorable attitudes, but Gaelic wasn't part of their lives at all. Everything that mattered in their lives, in their young lives, was in English, not in Gaelic. So will they really speak Gaelic to their children when the time comes? Probably not. That's something that we have to consider. And finally, children's perspectives are very important. As I said, children's attitudes. In research, we tend to test children, but then we ask the parents, we ask the teachers about the children. We never ask the children themselves. This is what we decided to do in a study that we did a couple of years ago, where we actually talked to bilingual children, not very young, not 2 years old. They were a bit older, and we had long conversations with them about, how they felt about, bilingual speakers, what they felt about their languages, when they use their languages, how much they liked speaking their languages, and so on. And what we found, we tested both Gaelic English bilinguals and children from migrant families who brought a different language with them. And what we found was that the more positive their attitudes their attitudes were, the higher the scores in language and cognitive tests were. So positive attitudes really, really matters. Children with positive attitudes in encouraging schools and environments and families are more likely, A, to become fluent in both languages, and B, to show the cognitive advantages of bilingualism. So we can't take this for granted. In this study, we had children who actually said, they didn't have a very favorable attitude towards their minority language, but they said, please don't tell my mom and dad because they don't know this. So, we really have to be careful about what we assume about children. And so we have to make children aware. And in our public engagement activities, we talk to children more and more. We increasingly talk to older children in Saturday morning classes, in cultural institutes, in schools, to make them aware of their bilingualism, to make them aware of how lucky they are and why learning languages is good for your brain in a way that they can understand. Obviously, we're not giving them boring lectures because that puts them off. But children are usually very keen. If you can communicate with them, they're very keen, they're very enthusiastic, they want to know more, and they have loads of questions. So any policy about language revitalization has to be connected with community of speakers. And this is what we find in many places where we work, that these policies are well-meaning, but sometimes they're not really connected with communities of speakers. And those communities are the ones that are responsible for the survival of the language. Because as I said, if they stop speaking the language to their children, the language won't go on, won't be transmitted, and ultimately won't survive. So I've spoken for long enough. What can be done? We think that accurate, accessible information to parents, learners, teachers, policymakers, health professionals about both the benefits of bilingualism and the challenges and the facts of bilingualism, multilingualism leads to better decisions, leads to informed decisions in all these sectors of society. And this is what we've been trying to do. This is the center I created 12 years ago. It's called Bilingualism Matters, and tries to bring research to people in a way that they can understand, in a way they can rely on. And over the years, we've formed a wide international network. We have 30 branches in 3 continents. We have 3 in Italy as well. And we're now spinning off as an independent social enterprise, and we hope we'll be able to collaborate with a wider range of people and stakeholders and organizations. This is our international network. We are a long waiting list of countries and places that want to join us. And at this point, I'll stop. I've spoken long enough, and I'm keen to hear your questions. These are the ways you can reach us if you want.
Thank you very much. And sorry for my video that you don't see, but before the question, I have also written my remarks. So it was very, very interesting presentation. So actually, you explained my confusion at the beginning for switching the languages.
Yes.
So for a moment, I stopped myself, and I was listening myself to be sure that I speak English, because I don't feel that what language I am talking. And other thing that for the grammar, for example, my son, that he is only 3 years old, that for sure didn't learn any grammar, and he often puts Italian word with Lithuanian ending now. 3 years old. For example, he likes a lot of firefighters, so he says pompieras.
Yes.
Italian, it's pompiere.
Yeah, well, it's very creative, you see.
Amazing that he is only 3 years old, and now he already understood how works these languages. So, and another thing that was also interesting, that also my son at first was thinking that only the mother speaks Lithuanian because of the pandemic. He have never met Lithuanian speaking children. So until this summer, because we went for 1 month and he went to kindergarten and in Lithuania for a month. And now he's asking any other children which language he speaks, and the other with the which are not bilingual, they don't understand this question actually. Which language, or Italian? Why you are asking that? Very nice. So we have two questions in chat, and then we will ask also there in the auditory. So I will read these questions. Laura, first I will read in English what is written, then I will translate to Lithuanian. So Christina Kutulita is asking, I'm sorry, did I understand correctly that bilingualism did better at tests? Bilinguals did better at tests, but monolinguals perform better in class. I didn't get this part.
No, I was referring to the fact that monolinguals in more bilingual classrooms did better than monolinguals in less bilingual classrooms. This is what I was saying. So not that monolinguals did better than bilinguals, but the effect of being in a multilingual classrooms where there were more languages around them apparently had an effect on their performance. So so that's what I mean. Monolinguals in more multilingual classrooms tended to do better than monolinguals in less multilingual classrooms. But generally, the bilinguals did better on a variety of tests.
Okay. The second question is, for example, in Lithuanian community abroad, we often have this kind of problem that not the same age children are in the class. So the question is it possible, or is it good to teach children with a range of different range of ages?
I know that, yeah, it's a very, very interesting question, and it's a problem that arises a bit everywhere, certainly here. Saturday morning classes, for example, it depends on how many children there are. Sometimes, you know, if the community is wider, then it is possible to distinguish, to divide them according to age. But if the community is smaller, then yes, as you said, children of different ages end up together. And at that point, you know, clearly, as I said, you know, children can be at very different levels of cognitive development. So you can't do activities for the oldest children, because that would exclude younger children. At the same time, doing activities at the lowest level runs the risk of making it very boring for the older children. It's a challenge that needs to be addressed. Ideally, you know, if there are enough children, enough children and teachers, of course, dividing them according to age would be more productive.
Yes, and I just want to add for this, for example, in our school, in virtual our school, we have three different range, like for example 4-6 years old, the one group, then 7-9 and 10-15.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah,
we think that kind of range is more than we couldn't do better, but this kind of close.
Yeah, no, that's very good. I think, you know, that's very good. If you can do that, you know, that is definitely to be commended.
Now I will ask if anyone have questions from auditory, so you can you can
turn on the microphone. Yeah, I would like to ask something, or I don't know, share my insight or something. So when you were speaking about the migrants, encouraging not to stop talking their own language and stuff, what I notice myself is like people, they're going into two extremes. One thing is the migrant when it arrives, jumps like completely dives into new language in order to improve as fast and as best as possible, so there would be less challenges in everyday life. The other extreme is that they still speaks their own native language as much as possible everywhere, and then that creates challenges at school. Obviously, when in the first case, when people dives into new language, then there's a risk to forget or stop talking or lose the habit in using their own native language. And to me, for me, it's really difficult to find that balance, because it's important to, integrate into new community, integrate into just to feel good and be accepted, and not to have a lot of challenges in everyday life, and not to be seen as a problem which needs to be solved at school or at work or everywhere else. So I don't know, what's your insight about this? What would be the best? How, for example, for the new immigrant who comes to new country and doesn't speak new language at all, how to balance that, so improve as quickly as possible, so they would be able to have a quality life in new country, but not to forget, not to lose that habit to maintain the first language, the native language. If you could share your thoughts and ideas. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the question. That is an absolutely crucial question. And as you said, it can be a challenge. It can be a challenge. The thing is that, of course, both parents and children, if they come from a completely new country and new language environment, they have to learn the language. The child, needs to hear the language, enough of the language to learn it, right? And they will learn it if they hear enough of the language. They don't need to hear the language from the parents as well. So, so there can be, a distinction between the language that is spoken at home that can continue to be, the home language, and the language spoken outside the home. So there has to be a system, an effort, and that's challenging, to have the child exposed to the community language as much as possible. In some communities, that is more difficult than in others, depending on cultural factors, and so on and so forth. But there's no need for the child to hear the community language from the parents who are themselves, learning the language. And so that leads very often to an impoverishment of the communication within the family, which is now good for the family and for family relationships and for family habits, as you said, and communication. So the optimum balance would be maintaining the home language, in the awareness, and this is what many people don't know, that maintaining the home language can be an advantage if the child hears enough and learns enough of the community language. The child will continue to be bilingual or multilingual, and that can bring advantages. Not only for family communication, but also for all the aspects that I've said. So how to face that? There are many differences, as I said, and many cultural differences but I think that at the root, there is a lot of lack of information, that we are trying to bridge. And there is no need to stop speaking the home language. I mean, clearly, it doesn't mean that you have to police the use of the language, in the sense that you get anxious, oh no, I mean, here we speak only our home language. I mean, if the child, is learning whatever the community language is, and very often they start speaking it at home as well. And this is what we hear from many families, right? Oh, my child doesn't want to speak my language anymore. They want to speak English, or they want to speak whatever. And that might be due to the fact that the child is learning more and more, or the child doesn't want to feel different from anybody else, and so they want to speak English everywhere. That is another difficult challenge that many families actually have. And our advice would be to continue to speak the home language without feeling anxious about it. Because if you create an environment where, the home language is associated with feeling weird or anxiety or feeling upset, children don't like that association either, so continue to use your home language, accept that your child may be replying in whatever the community language is, English, Italian, or whatever, for a while. Or we've seen many children who went through a stage where they didn't want to speak the home language, they replied in English, but then, sometime later, they went back to the home language because they continued to hear it. And so they hadn't lost it. It's a challenge, but the important thing to remember is that there's no reason to abandon the home language. It doesn't prejudice the learning of and the integration of a child, and it can give a series of advantages.
I also would like to share one more thing, just from my experience, from my own family. So I live in London, obviously, so I'm Lithuanian living in London. And my 10-year-old girl, actually both, they don't see Lithuanian language as a cool language to speak, as much useful and stuff. But the funny thing is that, for example, in her class, there are many bilingual kids, but especially one. So there's a Italian girl, and my own daughter thinks that it's so cool that her friend is speaking Italian fluently. It's so cool to know Italian language and stuff, and it just it makes me feel sad that she doesn't see Lithuanian as a cool extra thing to know. But she sees another person who speaks different language, such a cool thing to do. And, so again, just like how to motivate kids, if you have any advice in that. Thank you.
That happens, we've heard stories like that. I mean, children learn a lot from other children. Once they start schooling, they start socializing with other children, and obviously you can't predict, the kind of experiences, the kind of, that they're going to have in their interaction with children. I think, you can try to make Lithuanian cool as well by, I don't know how often you travel to Lithuania. I mean, that, in my view, that can really do wonders. I mean, I remember my children, whenever we went to Italy, their Italian not only became, much better almost immediately, but then, the fact that they could play in Italian with other children and so on, that really did wonders for their perception of Italian. So I think, in short, I think, trying to make Lithuanian as much as a part of their lives as much as you can, that would be great. So other children, games, if you can travel. I know traveling is not easy right now, and it hasn't been for a while, but, again, discovering that, wow, you can play with other children, you can have fun in Lithuanian, you can do things that you can't do in other languages and things like that. So it's more difficult to create that environment, when you're abroad. But
respond to your question about how often traveling, obviously this year was difficult. Yeah. The ones, but in summertime I really try to go at least for a month, like 4-6 weeks, as long as possible. But the problem is now, for a few years, for 2-3 years now, basically everyone in our environment over there speaks, or at least understand, Lithuanian. 3 years ago, there was this youngest nephew who still wasn't able to speak English. So at that time, my kids' Lithuanian improved really drastically every single time we went there. But as soon as the youngest nephew started understand and speak English. That's it. My girls don't see the necessity to try to speak in Lithuanian. So now what happens? So when we over there, everyone is improving English, but my girls are not improving Lithuanian. And obviously, you know, their parents are happy. Oh, my kids have the opportunity to practice in real life English and stuff like that. But for me, it's like, oh my goodness. And they do like, okay, so let's do this. So the kid who lives in Lithuania, you speak English, but you need to speak Lithuanian. So, you know, you respond in Lithuanian, just like do that. But just like nothing, whatever I try to encourage, it's impossible. If I am policing, then they try, you know, try to talk only in Lithuanian. But as soon as I turn away, let's say they, you know, my nephew obviously speaks in very, very broken English, but that's enough for them to communicate. And my girls don't see the necessity to, you know, do the hard work and improve their Lithuanian language. So that's, again, it just, I don't know, it just feels like it's a dead end, and I don't know how to help them.
I'm sorry.
Can I just say it's not a dead end, and yes.
I'm sorry. Before you comment this, I just want to say that we are finishing, and I want to also ask any others that if they have questions. So after this, after you comment, I will ask any others if they have questions. Can you raise the hands, for example, if any from here in the auditorium have any questions? Okay, so no one has, so you can continue, but 5 minutes.
Oh yeah, no, even less. I mean, I just wanted to end on a positive note. Try not to get anxious about it. And remember that, again, the perfect bilingual doesn't exist. If your children understand Lithuanian, that's already a very, very big foundation, solid foundation, which means that, you know, if later, you know, things change and they go to Lithuania, they spend more time in Lithuania, their speaking abilities will come up, you know. So the fact that they understand everything, try to maintain that. Don't expect them to be, you know, completely fluent, you know, when they're in London. But life circumstances can change, and providing them, you know, with a solid comprehension abilities, you know, ability to understand, is already a very big step. And as there, you know, there will be more opportunities, you know, to visit Lithuania, use Lithuanian with other people and so on, you'll see that their production abilities will emerge.
Okay, thank you. And one question from me, I was asking how many languages at a time we can learn. For example, I just, in my family, I'm also bilingual. I speak Lithuanian, Russian. So, and my children are Italian, Lithuanian, Russian, and he goes to bilingual preschool, English, Italian. So is it possible 4 languages at a time?
Yes, in fact, I have my collaborator who their family has 5 languages. So she's Polish, her husband is Spanish. They met in Germany, so they speak German to one another. Their children were born here, so they speak English, and they go to Gallic school. So that's 5. Now, the quick answer is, it is possible to have many languages, but remember what I said at the beginning, a child needs to hear enough of each of them. So if you put many languages in the equation, and they're all heard to the same amounts, it's very, very little. So what happens normally is that, you know, a child may hear, you know, different languages, they say 4 languages, like in your case, and learn to understand all languages, but, you know, they really become fluent in only 2 of them or 3, because those are the languages that are heard and used more often. Then, you know, if the situation changes, you know, and for example, your children may spend, you know, more time, I don't know, in an English-speaking environment or in a Russian-speaking environment, those languages that have been behind initially might actually take over. So that's what I said at the beginning, don't expect the same level of competence. It's impossible, but do expect that, the competence may change depending on circumstances, and providing them with good comprehension abilities in all the languages is a great gift that provides the basis for adaptations, to future experiences.
Yeah, I completely understand, because even for my experience, then I was not using a lot Russian, and I was speaking only with my father for a moment. So then I was put in this environment of Russians. So for a couple of days or weeks, even if I was Russian is my mother tongue, so I couldn't speak fluently. Only after 1 week of practicing, maybe I was able to speak fluently. So even
that's normal. Yes, that's absolutely normal. But you see, it means that all the languages are in your brain. Your brain knows better. They need to be reactivated, if they haven't been used for a while. But they're there. They're not lost.
So, okay, we have 2 questions. You can put the...
Hello?
Okay, the question is that how to encourage and to reach parents to give this information that you now explained, that they know, they teach, and they are encouraged to do that. Yeah, how to reach parents with this information?
Well, there are several channels. I mean, my center is very happy to provide you with, materials if you want, and, materials that can be translated. Obviously, we don't have materials in all languages as much as we would like, but it could be done, through the cultural institutes in Italy, for example, or in other country, or the consulates and embassies. We work with cultural institutes and consulates and all the time in many different countries. Or just get in touch with me, and you can distribute. You're free to distribute my slides, but to do something locally, maybe you can get not only other parents involved, but also the cultural institute and the consulate as well.
Okay, I'll just specify if the question was to divide these slides, kind of. Just the practical things. Yes. Yeah. So the question is the practical things, how to reach the parents. So.
Yes, I know. Well, we don't have a branch in Rome yet. That could be your port of call for questions and so on. The question is
any good practice, I mean, in your all how to encourage to.
Yes, I mean, parents have many questions usually, and you need somebody who can actually answer these questions, and possibly somebody who's locally,
like available. A parent line, for example, for bilingualism.
I mean, we would be very happy to collaborate with you, in ways that might be useful to you. As I said, or, we can get one of our Italian branches involved. As I said, there needs to be somebody there who can actually, get involved with parents and encourage parents to get together and interact with one another. That's also very important, because they can exchange information and they can exchange experiences and so on. So if you think we can help in any ways, you know, and as we've helped, you know, in many different places, you know, in the world, just let us know.
Thank you very much. I think that we are
Yeah.
just, and another, the last question. So.
Hello, I'm
Okay.
Arūnas from Dublin, from Ireland, and we have Lithuanian school in Ware, and we had some kind of such problems that some kids are coming to school, parents are bringing them, but some of them, we are very much apprehensive and even can be quite hostile towards learning the language. You know, and saying that we don't need that language, etc., etc. We tried to talk with parents a little bit, and we probably noticed that some of those parents actually having quite critical, you know, attitude to other Lithuanians, in general to Lithuanian, as you said, that considering the language to be slightly, you know, not useful, etc. But actually, we want them, their children, to learn that language because we are coming to their parents, etc., etc. So, my question: have you noticed in your, you know, research that, you know, attitude of parents, especially psychological attitude of parents towards their own actual native language, can, you know, be transferred to children and influence, you know, the motivation of children to learn, you know, that language? Thank you.
The short answer is yes, absolutely. I mean, parents' attitudes are very important, and they do influence children's attitudes. There's no doubt about it, particularly, you know, younger children, adolescent children, you know, may go against their parents, you know, when they reach their age, but young children are very much influenced by parental attitudes. And that's why it's important to reach out to families. That's why it's important to give families the right kind of information about the importance of maintaining their languages, you know, not only. Yeah, I mean, I understand that there may be many reasons why parents, you know, have these negative attitudes about their language, you know, and I'm not the one who judges, you know, any of these attitudes, but making them aware that, you know, their language can be a resource, you know, that helps, you know, all kinds of aspects of development in their child. I think, you know, most parents don't have that kind of information. You know, so I think, you know, reaching out and giving parents that kind of positive attitude is important. And yes, I mean, children absorb parental attitudes. I mean, we see this, you know, in the UK in general, about attitudes about learning languages. I mean, you know, if parents think, as many do, right, what's the point of learning a language? You know, everybody speaks English. We are now out of the EU because of Brexit and so on. And so what's the point? I mean, a child won't be particularly encouraged, you know, to learn another language. So I think it's important, yes, to reach out and make parents aware of the benefits of keeping their home language that go beyond, you know, actually speaking their language and allowing their children to speak to grandparents and other members of the family. That is also potentially important for many families. But yeah, it's very important to reach out and make sure that they have enough information.
Thank you very much, and we need to finish. And I think that if we could speak, I don't know, for all the day.
Oh, I know.
So, and I think that we will ask you also to do this in Italian, but later, and we will talk about that later.
Yeah.
But we were recording this your presentation, so we will share this very, very useful information. And thank you very much, and we are very honored to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me.
and lots of people that are in chat also are thanking, and thank you.
Thank you, Nell. Let's keep in touch.
Let's keep it.
Thank you.
Ciao.
Bye.
We can
Thank you.
end